The cruelty of the court was a poison administered in slow, exquisite doses. It was not in the clash of swords or the pronouncements of law, but in the silences that fell when Myra entered a room, in the delicate arch of a noblewoman's eyebrow, in the whispers that rustled like dry leaves in her wake. They were masters of the art, these gilded men and women of Valdric's inner circle. They could flay a soul with a well-placed word and leave no visible wound. Baseborn, they murmured behind silk fans, the word a sibilant hiss that clung to the tapestries. Barren, they sighed with false pity, their eyes glittering with malice as they glanced at her flat belly, then at the king who needed an heir. Myra endured it. She learned to build a fortress inside herself, to hold her spine as straight as the castle's spires and meet their contempt with a placid mask. She wore the magnificent gowns and the heavy jewels they felt she didn't deserve, each gem a cold weight against her skin, a reminder of the gilded cage she inhabited. She walked through the grand halls of the citadel, a ghost in her own home, her footsteps echoing in the vast, indifferent spaces. Tonight was a banquet celebrating a trade alliance with the Southern Isles, and the great hall was a suffocating tapestry of noise and scent. The air, thick with the smell of roasted boar, spiced wine, and the cloying perfume of 100 courtiers, pressed in on her. Laughter, sharp and brittle, shattered against the high, vaulted ceilings. Myra sat at the high table, a decorative doll beside an empty throne. Valdric was not beside her. He was circulating, a king attending to his duties, his voice a low, confident murmur as he negotiated with portly merchants and flattered grim-faced ambassadors. He was good at this, the intricate dance of power. He was a king, every inch of him. He was just no longer her husband. She watched him from across the expanse of polished oak and glittering silver. He had a way of listening, his head tilted just so, that made any man feel he was the most important person in the world. He had listened to her that way, once. In the beginning, when he was just Valdric, a prince with a startling laugh and eyes the color of a winter sky, he had sought her out in her father's library, where she worked as a scribe's assistant. He had loved her mind, he'd said. Her quiet strength. He had chosen her, a woman with no title and no fortune, and made her his queen. He had promised to be her shield. But a shield forgotten in the armory is of no use. Her eyes swept the room, cataloguing the familiar faces of her tormentors. There was Lord Greymark, his beard impeccably trimmed, watching her with an expression of faint, academic amusement, as if she were a curious specimen pinned to a board. And there, holding court by the massive stone hearth, was Duchess Isolde. Her hair was a marvel of silver braids and pearls, her face a carefully preserved mask of aristocratic disdain. She leaned toward her companion, her lips barely moving, but Myra did not need to hear the words. She could feel them. She had felt them for 2 years. The Duchess's gaze flickered toward Myra, cold and dismissive, and Myra felt the familiar, hot shame rise in her cheeks. She took a sip of wine, the liquid cool against her dry throat. She wished, with a desperate, childish ache, that Valdric would look at her. Not a fleeting, distracted glance, but a real look. That he would see the rigid set of her shoulders, the tightness around her mouth. That he would cross the room, take her hand, and stand by her side, a silent, unbreachable declaration. But he did not. He laughed at something an ambassador said, his head thrown back, the firelight catching the gold threads in his tunic. To him, this room was a triumph of diplomacy. To her, it was the battlefield where she lost a piece of herself each day. Later, as the evening bled into its final hours, he did finally catch her eye. He offered her a small, tired smile from across the room. It was a gesture meant to be reassuring, a silent acknowledgement. "I am busy, but I see you." But it was not enough. It had not been enough for a long time. The smile was a king's courtesy, not a husband's comfort. It did not reach his eyes. It did not cross the chasm that had opened between them. It was a pebble tossed into an ocean of neglect. Myra lowered her gaze to the intricate pattern of her plate, the painted falcons forever frozen in mid-flight, and felt a profound and terrifying loneliness settle over her. She was the queen, and she had never been more alone. The whispers were not the poison, she realized with a clarity that chilled her to the bone. They were merely the symptom. The disease was the silence that followed. The disease was the empty space beside her. She excused herself quietly, a slight nod to the guards her only announcement. No one tried to stop her. No one of importance even noticed she was gone. As she walked the long, cold corridor back to her chambers, the distant sounds of music and laughter faded behind her, and the only sound was the rustle of her own silk gown, whispering secrets to the stone. The royal chambers felt as vast and impersonal as the great hall. They were rooms designed for a queen, not for Myra. The tapestries depicted ancient battles, the furniture was heavy and ornate, and the bed was a fortress of carved oak and velvet draperies. She had never felt at home here. She walked to the large window, pushing aside a heavy damask curtain. Below, the city glittered, a sea of scattered lights under a moonless sky. It was his city. His kingdom. She was just a transient guest. A sudden wave of nausea washed over her, sharp and unwelcome. She pressed a hand to her stomach, her breath catching in her throat. It was the third time this week. The rich food, she told herself. The stress. But as she stood there, staring out at the indifferent lights of the capital, a different possibility began to take root in the back of her mind, a fragile, terrifying bloom of an idea. Her monthly courses were late. She had dismissed it, her cycle often erratic under the strain of her life here. But now, coupled with the fatigue that had been dragging at her for weeks, the bouts of sickness. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. With trembling hands, she lit a candle and walked to the small table where her personal effects were kept. Tucked away in a small wooden box was a calendar, a simple thing she used to mark the passage of time. Her fingers traced the neat, inked squares. 6 weeks. It had been 6 weeks. The realization did not crash over her, it seeped into her, a slow, spreading chill that was somehow also a spark of impossible warmth. Pregnant. After 2 years of whispered accusations of barrenness, of her own private, aching fears, she was with child. For a single, breathless moment, pure, unadulterated joy soared through her. A child. A piece of her, a piece of the Valdric she had once loved, to hold and to cherish. A reason. A purpose beyond enduring. She imagined a small hand in hers, a sleepy head on her shoulder. A life that was hers to nurture, to protect. And then, just as quickly, the joy curdled into ice-cold dread. Protect. How could she protect a child in this place? A child born into this nest of vipers, to be scrutinized and judged from its first breath. A son would be a political pawn. A daughter, a disappointment. Either would be a weapon for the court to use, another way to wound her, another vulnerability for them to exploit. And Valdric, would he see a child, or an heir? Would he see a person, or a solution to a dynastic problem? The image of Duchess Isolde's cruel smile flashed in her mind. She pictured those cold eyes on her child, heard the whispers turning on a new, more helpless target. She saw her son or daughter growing up in these cold stone halls, learning to navigate the treacherous currents of the court, learning to wear a mask as she had. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp blade twisting in her gut. No. She would not allow it. She would not raise a child in a place where love was a currency and kindness a weakness. The decision formed not as a thought, but as a deep, primal certainty that rose from the very core of her being. She had to leave. It was not an act of anger or spite. It was an act of preservation, the most profound act of maternal love she could imagine. She had endured the court's cruelty for herself, but she would not subject her child to it. She would not let them be broken on the wheel of their ambition and prejudice. Her movements became methodical, deliberate. There was no frantic haste, only a grim, quiet purpose. She went to the large wardrobe, its doors carved with the royal crest. She pushed past the heavy velvets and shimmering silks, the gowns that felt like costumes for a role she no longer wished to play. At the very back, she found what she was looking for, a simple dress of dark wool, the kind a merchant's wife might wear, and a sturdy traveling cloak with a deep hood. She changed, the rough wool a comforting, honest texture against her skin after years of suffocating silk. She looked around the opulent room, a prison of treasures. She would take nothing. Not the jewels Valdric had gifted her, their fire cold and meaningless. Not the books or the trinkets. They belonged to the queen. Myra was leaving that woman behind. Her eyes fell on a small, carved wooden bird resting on the mantelpiece. Valdric had made it for her during their courtship, his large hands surprisingly deft. It was a crude thing, a simple sparrow, but she had treasured it. It was a relic of a different man, a different time. For a moment, her fingers hovered over it, the last link to the man she had loved. Then, she drew her hand back. That man was gone. Taking the bird would be like carrying a ghost with her. She had a new life to think of now. She packed a small satchel with a loaf of bread, a block of cheese from her untouched dinner tray, and a flask of water. She added a few coins she had saved, her own small secret hoard. It wasn't much, but it would be enough to get her away from the capital. As she stood at the door, she took one last look at the room, at the life she was abandoning. There was no regret. Only a vast, aching sadness for what might have been, and a fierce, burning resolve for what must be. She slipped out of the chambers, a shadow moving through the sleeping castle. The guards at the outer gate barely glanced at her, her hooded figure just another servant heading home late. The city air was cool on her face, a promise of freedom. She did not look back. She walked toward the dawn, with a secret nestled in her womb and a future she would have to build with her own 2 hands. For 3 days, the king did not notice she was gone. The first day was consumed by the departure of the southern delegation. There were treaties to sign, final negotiations to oversee. Valdric ate a hurried breakfast in his study, his mind on shipping lanes and tariffs. He registered Myra's absence from their table as a fleeting thought, assuming she was tired after the long banquet and had chosen to sleep late. He made a mental note to check on her later, a note that was promptly buried under the weight of a dozen more pressing matters of state. The day passed in a blur of meetings and official farewells. By the time he retired to his chambers, exhausted, the thought of Myra was a distant echo. He slept alone in the great bed, the space beside him cool and empty, and did not truly register the difference. The second day, a border dispute with the northern baronies flared up, demanding his immediate attention. Messengers galloped in and out of the citadel, their horses lathered, their faces grim. Valdric spent the day in the strategy room with his generals, poring over maps, his world reduced to topographical lines and troop movements. A faint sense of unease pricked at the edges of his consciousness, a feeling of something being out of place, like a discordant note in a familiar symphony. He dismissed it as the tension of the impending conflict. At the midday meal, which he took with his war council, he asked a passing servant, "Is the Queen feeling better today?" The young woman looked at him, her expression blank with confusion. "Better, Your Majesty," she stammered. I was not aware she was unwell." Valdric frowned, a flicker of irritation passing through him. The incompetence of his staff was astounding. He would speak to Myra about it himself when he had a moment. The moment never came. The afternoon was lost to logistics, the evening to drafting dispatches. He fell into bed long after midnight, his mind still on the northern border, and the empty space beside him went unnoticed once more. It was on the morning of the third day that the silence finally became loud enough for him to hear. He woke to a quiet castle, the early light filtering through the high windows of his chamber. The crisis with the barons had been averted, a tense truce negotiated in the dead of night. For the first time in days, there was no immediate demand on his attention. And in that quiet, the wrongness of it all crashed down upon him. The rooms were still. Too still. Myra was an early riser. He should be hearing the soft rustle of her moving about her adjoining chambers, the gentle clink of a cup. There was nothing. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, pierced through the fog of his exhaustion. He rose from the bed and walked to the door that connected their chambers. He knocked. "Myra?" Silence. He knocked again, louder this time, a frantic edge to the sound. "Myra, are you there?" Still nothing. He pushed the door open. The room was pristine, cold, and utterly empty. Her bed was perfectly made, the covers undisturbed. A book lay on her nightstand, a ribbon marking her place. On her dressing table, her silver-backed brush and comb lay in their usual spot. Her jewelry box was closed. He strode over to it and threw open the lid. The pearls and sapphires and diamonds he had lavished upon her lay nestled in their velvet beds, their cold fire mocking him. She had taken none of them. He moved through her rooms like a man in a nightmare, his heart pounding a sickening rhythm against his ribs. Her wardrobe was full of gowns. He tore through them, his hands shaking, searching for, he didn't know what. A sign. A note. An explanation. He found nothing but silk and velvet. Then he saw it. At the very back of the wardrobe, an empty hook where her plainest traveling cloak used to hang. It was gone. Her sturdy walking boots were also missing from the floor beneath it. The truth did not dawn, it struck him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. She was gone. She hadn't just left for the day. She had left him. And he, her husband, her king, her sworn protector, had not even noticed for 3 days. 3 entire days. The enormity of his failure washed over him, a tidal wave of shame and horror. He had been so consumed with the business of being a king that he had forgotten how to be a man. He had let the whispers of his court fester, had seen the sadness in her eyes and looked away because it was easier than confronting the vipers he allowed to surround them. He had stood by, silent and useless, while the woman he loved was slowly erased before his very eyes. And when she had finally vanished completely, he hadn't even heard the sound she made. He stumbled back and sank onto the edge of her perfectly made bed, the bed she had not slept in for 3 nights. He buried his face in his hands, the image of her face at the banquet pale, strained, and so terribly alone, burning in his mind. He had given her a distracted smile from across the room. A meaningless, empty gesture while her world was collapsing. The silence in the room was no longer just an absence of sound. It was an accusation. It was the sound of his own heart breaking. The years that followed were a blur of green and gold, of sun and snow, a gentle rhythm dictated by the seasons, not by the ringing of court bells. Myra found her way to a small, forgotten village nestled at the edge of the Whisperwood, a place so remote it was barely a speck on any royal map. She called herself Mara, a simple widow, and bought a small, dilapidated cottage with the few coins she had. The villagers were quiet and reserved, people who valued privacy and hard work over lineage and gossip. They accepted her story without question and left her to her peace. She learned the land. She learned which mushrooms were safe to eat, which herbs could soothe a fever, which roots made a hearty stew. She repaired the leaking roof of her cottage with her own hands, her palms growing calloused and strong. She planted a garden, coaxing life from the rich, dark soil. For the first time in years, she felt the sun on her face without the weight of a crown, felt the dirt under her fingernails, and felt a sense of belonging that the cold stones of the citadel had never offered. Her daughter was born in the heart of winter, with the snow falling thick and silent outside the cottage windows. Myra delivered her alone, with only the crackling fire for company, her own screams swallowed by the thick stone walls. She named her Ilara, for a star that shone brightest in the cold months. The child was a miracle, small and perfect, with a tuft of dark hair like her own and eyes the startling, impossible blue of a winter sky. Valdric's eyes. Looking at her daughter was a constant, bittersweet ache. In the fierce, determined set of Ilara's tiny jaw, Myra saw the king she had left behind. But in her laughter, in the way she chased butterflies through the meadow with uninhibited joy, Myra saw the freedom she had fought for. She raised Ilara on stories of clever foxes and brave little birds, not of kings and queens. She taught her the names of the wildflowers and the constellations. Their world was small, circumscribed by the edge of the woods and the bend in the river, but it was whole. It was safe. It was hers. Meanwhile, 500 miles away, a hollow king sat on his throne. Valdric's initial search had been a frantic, desperate thing. He had sent scouts to every corner of the kingdom, offered rewards that could make a peasant a lord, and interrogated every guard and servant who might have seen her leave. But Myra had been clever, covering her tracks, vanishing into the vast tapestry of the common folk. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, the frantic search settled into a long, grim obsession. He ruled his kingdom, and by all accounts, he ruled it well. He was just, decisive, and tirelessly dedicated. But the light had gone out of him. His laughter was never heard in the halls, and his winter sky eyes were clouded with a permanent storm of regret. He began to see his court not as a collection of advisors and nobles, but as the toxic ecosystem that had poisoned his marriage. He started to truly listen to the whispers, not to ignore them, and what he heard sickened him. He began to understand. It wasn't one cruel remark that had driven her away. It was the 1,000 small cuts, and his unforgivable failure to be her shield. The knowledge was a constant, grinding weight on his soul. He had failed her in every way a man could fail a woman. He did not know if she was alive or dead, but he kept searching, driven by a sliver of hope that was more painful than despair. 5 years passed. Ilara was a whirlwind of energy and questions, her small legs carrying her fearlessly through the woods she considered her backyard. She knew nothing of her father, only that he was a man who had gone away on a long journey, a story Myra had constructed to shield her from a truth she was too young to understand. One bright summer afternoon, Myra was in her garden, her hands deep in the warm earth, when Ilara came running from the edge of the woods, her blue eyes wide. "Mama," she said, her voice a breathless whisper. "There's a sad man in the trees." Myra's blood ran cold. She stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She followed Ilara's pointing finger. And there, standing just within the shadow of the great oaks, was a figure. He was dressed in simple, dirt-stained traveler's clothes, but there was no mistaking the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head. He was older, his dark hair threaded with silver at the temples, his face etched with lines of grief and exhaustion she had never seen before. But it was him. It was Valdric. He took a hesitant step out of the shadows, and his eyes, those same impossible blue eyes that stared up at her from her daughter's face every day, found hers. For a long moment, the world seemed to stop. The buzz of the bees in the lavender, the whisper of the wind in the grass, it all fell silent. In his eyes, she saw 5 years of searching, of regret, of a pain that mirrored her own. Then he saw Ilara, who was clinging to Myra's skirts, peering at the stranger with open curiosity. Valdric's gaze dropped to the child, to her dark hair, her determined jaw, her winter sky eyes. A look of such profound, shattering recognition passed over his face that he physically staggered, one hand reaching out as if to steady himself against an invisible wall. He froze, his breath catching, the king of a vast and powerful nation struck dumb by the sight of a little girl in a sun-drenched meadow. Myra moved, her body acting before her mind could process the tidal wave of emotion crashing over her. She stepped in front of Ilara, a human shield, her body a silent, unbreachable declaration. The fortress she had built inside herself all those years ago rose up, stone by cold stone. Her face was a mask of granite. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was low, rough with disuse in this particular battle. Valdric couldn't seem to tear his eyes away from Ilara. "Myra," he breathed, his voice hoarse, thick with 5 years of unspoken words. I found you." "You were not meant to," she said, her voice flat and cold. "This life is not for you. This child is not for you." "She has my eyes," he whispered, a statement of such raw, aching wonder it was almost a prayer. "She has her mother's strength," Myra countered, her voice like flint. "Something you know nothing about." The words struck him, and he flinched as if physically hit. His gaze finally lifted from Ilara to meet Myra's. The king was gone. In his place was only a man, stripped bare, his soul naked and wounded in his eyes. "Myra, please." "Please what?" she demanded, the bitterness of years finally spilling over. "Please let you sweep in and claim what you never earned. Let you play the father after I endured the birth alone, fought the fevers alone, and woke every night to soothe her nightmares alone. You stood by while your court called me barren. You let them call me unworthy. You let them strip me of my dignity, piece by piece, and you never said a word. You do not get to claim what I raised alone." Each word was a stone she threw at him, and he did not flinch away. He absorbed every blow, his face crumbling with the weight of her truth. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He didn't issue a single royal command. He simply nodded, his throat working. "You're right," he said, his voice cracking. "I know. I was a coward. I was a fool. I failed you." He took a small, pleading step forward, his hands open and empty at his sides. "I am not here for an heir," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she hadn't heard in a decade. "I am not here for a princess. I am here for you, Myra. I came for you." He sank to his knees in the soft grass of the meadow, the proud king kneeling before the scribe's assistant he had wronged. "Please," he begged, tears tracking paths through the dust on his face. "Just let me apologize." Myra stood immovable, a statue carved from rage and grief, the warm, living weight of her daughter pressed against her leg. The king was on his knees, begging. But the man she needed had been the one who should have stood up for her, all those years ago. She looked down at him, this broken stranger with her husband's face, and she felt nothing but the vast, cold emptiness of the years he had stolen from them. "Go away, Valdric," she said, her voice devoid of heat, a chilling, final command. "There is nothing for you here." She turned, scooped a bewildered Elara into her arms, and walked back to the small stone cottage that was her sanctuary, her fortress, her home. She did not look back to see if he was still kneeling in the meadow, a king alone with the ghosts of his own making. The heavy wooden door of the cottage closed behind her with a sound of absolute finality, shutting out the man, the king, and the entire world that had once tried to break her. He did not leave. Myra had expected him to, had perhaps even counted on it. The Valdric she knew, the king, would not abide such a dismissal. He would retreat, his pride wounded, and perhaps send emissaries, turning this raw, personal wound into a matter of state. But this man, the one who knelt in her meadow, was different. He did not retreat to the capital. He walked the half-mile to the village and took a room at the Stag and Harrow, the local inn. He paid the innkeeper with common currency, not royal gold, and asked for nothing more than a bed and a quiet meal. The next morning, a boy from the village appeared at her gate, holding a folded piece of parchment. It was not sealed with the royal crest. It was simple, unadorned. Myra's hands trembled as she took it. His script, once so bold and confident, was now spare, almost hesitant. "Myra," it read. "I will not force myself upon you. I will wait at the edge of the woods, by the old standing stone, until midday. If you do not come, I will understand. I will leave and never trouble you again. I ask for nothing but 5 minutes to say what I should have said 5 years ago. Valdric." She crumpled the note in her fist, her knuckles white. The audacity. The sheer arrogance to think he could summon her, even now. Her first instinct was to burn the note, to bar the door and ignore his plea. She owed him nothing. She had built this life from the ashes of the one he had allowed to burn. But Elara, perceptive as always, watched her with wide, serious eyes. "Is that from the sad man, Mama?" Myra smoothed her expression, forcing a calmness she did not feel. "Yes, little bird." Why is he sad? How could she explain the complexities of betrayal and neglect to a 5-year-old? Because, Myra said, choosing her words with care, he lost something very important a long time ago. And he has only just realized it. "You?" Elara asked, her innocence a sharp, clean blade to Myra's heart. Myra could not answer. She spent the morning in a state of turmoil, her hands mechanically weeding the garden while her mind raged. Every fiber of her being screamed for self-preservation. To see him was to open a door to a world of pain she had fought so hard to lock away. He was a king. His world was one of power, of politics, of gilded cages. Her world was this earth, this sky, this child. The two could not coexist. And yet, a part of her, a foolish, stubborn part she thought had died long ago, was curious. What could he possibly say that would matter now? What words could bridge the chasm of 3 days of silence and 5 years of absence? She looked at the crumpled note in her hand. "I will understand." That was new. The old Valdric had never understood. He had commanded, and he had expected to be obeyed. This hint of humility, of deference to her will, was a foreign and unsettling thing. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, she found herself walking toward the edge of the woods. She told herself it was to finally and firmly tell him to go, to see for herself that he understood her command. It was not for him. It was for her own peace of mind. He was there, just as he had promised, standing by the ancient, moss-covered stone that marked the entrance to the forest path. He looked as if he hadn't slept. When he saw her approaching, a look of profound, desperate relief washed over his face. He did not rush toward her. He stood his ground, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. He was giving her the power, the space. "You came," he said, his voice quiet. "I came to tell you to leave," she stated, her arms crossed over her chest, a physical barrier. He nodded, accepting it. "I will. But first, let me say this. Not as a king to a subject, or a husband to a wife. But as a man who has made a terrible mistake. I am sorry, Myra. I am sorry for every whisper I pretended not to hear. For every sneer I ignored. For every time you looked at me for help and I looked away. I was a coward. I was so consumed with the idea of being a strong king that I failed at the only thing that truly mattered, being a good man. I did not protect you. I did not honor you. I did not deserve you. My silence was not just neglect, it was a betrayal. And I will live with the shame of it for the rest of my days." He paused, his gaze unwavering, his winter sky eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed bottomless. "That is all I wanted to say. I will not ask for your forgiveness, because I have not earned it. I will not ask for the child. She is yours. You saved her from the life I would have given her. You have done a better job than I ever could. I will leave now." He bowed his head, a gesture of profound respect, and turned to walk away. Myra watched him go, his shoulders slumped, the very picture of defeat. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. He had said everything she had ever longed to hear. He had offered no excuses, no justifications. He had simply owned his failure, completely and unequivocally. "Valdric," she called out, the name feeling strange on her tongue after so long. He stopped, his back still to her. "The villagers need help mending the roof on the mill," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "The storms damaged it last winter." He turned back slowly, his face a mask of confusion. "What?" "It requires strong hands," she continued, her voice steady. "If you are looking for a way to be useful before you leave, it was not forgiveness. It was not an invitation. It was a test. A small, almost cruel test. Let him work. Let him sweat. Let him feel the burn of honest labor in a world far from his silks and his throne." A flicker of something, hope, perhaps, ignited in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "Of course. I can do that." This was the first day of his 3-year penance. He did not try to see her again that day. He went to the mill, removed his fine leather tunic, and worked alongside the village men, his clumsy, unpracticed hands struggling with the hammers and saws. He worked until his back ached and his palms were raw and blistered. And as Myra watched from a distance, hidden by the trees, she saw a king learning, for the first time, the meaning of service. Valdric returned to the capital a different man. The news of his journey, of his discovery, was a carefully guarded secret, known only to his most trusted captain of the guard. But his demeanor had changed. The hollow grief had been replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. He had a purpose now, one that had nothing to do with treaties or borders. He had a name to restore. His first act was to summon the royal council. He walked into the chamber, his presence commanding a silence that was born of a new and unfamiliar authority. He did not take his seat at the head of the table. He stood before the hearth, his gaze sweeping over the assembled lords and ladies, many of whom had been the architects of Myra's misery. His eyes landed on Duchess Isolde. She sat, as always, radiating an aura of untouchable privilege, a faint, condescending smirk playing on her lips. "Duchess," Valdric began, his voice deceptively calm, "do you recall Queen Myra?" The question hung in the air, a sudden chill in the warm room. Isolde's smirk faltered. "Of course, Your Majesty. A tragic loss." "It was not a loss," Valdric corrected, his voice hardening, each word a chip of ice. "It was an expulsion. She was driven from this court, from her home, by a campaign of relentless, petty cruelty. By whispers and lies. By the sort of casual malice that cowards disguise as courtly wit." He took a step toward her, his eyes boring into hers. "You were fond of the word baron, I believe. You spoke it often, in rooms where you thought I could not hear. You questioned her bloodline. You mocked her character. You did this to my wife. My queen." He let the title hang in the air, a rebuke and a reminder. For this, for your profound and unforgivable failure of human decency, you are stripped of your titles, your lands, and your seat on this council. You will be exiled from this city by sunset. Should you ever return, it will be considered an act of treason." A collective gasp swept the room. Isolde's face went white with shock, then purple with rage. "You cannot," she sputtered. "My family has served the crown for generations. And you have disgraced them," Valdric said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "You slandered the best and kindest person I have ever known. And you did it while I, to my eternal shame, stood by and allowed it. That ends today. My reign has been one of tolerance for too long. From this day forward, it will be a reign of consequences." He turned his gaze on Lord Greymark, who was visibly sweating. "Lord Greymark, your lands in the west are hereby forfeit to the crown. You will spend the next year overseeing the rebuilding of the northern garrisons. Perhaps a taste of honest work in a harsh climate will improve your character." One by one, he went through them. The whisperers. The sneerers. He didn't shout or rage. He was a surgeon, excising a cancer with cold, precise cuts. He was dismantling the court that had broken his wife, and he was doing it using her name as both his sword and his shield. He spoke of her with a reverence and love that stunned the council into silence. He was not just punishing them, he was rewriting history. He was telling them, and all the kingdom, that they had not driven away a base-born commoner. They had wronged a queen. And their king had finally come to collect the debt. News of the purge traveled fast. Merchants and travelers carried the tale to every corner of the realm. It reached Myra's village within a month. The innkeeper told her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He spoke of the king's cold fury, of Duchess Isolde being escorted from the city in a plain carriage, stripped of her finery. Myra listened, her hands clutching a bundle of dried lavender, the fragrant scent doing nothing to calm the storm inside her. He was fighting for her. Years too late, in an arena she had long since abandoned, he was finally fighting the battle he should have fought by her side. It was a grand, public, kingly gesture. It was impressive. It was powerful. But as she stood in her quiet garden, with the scent of lavender and damp earth around her, she knew it changed nothing. A wound healed with a scar. He could punish the hands that held the knives, but he could not undo the cutting. He was defending the honor of a queen who no longer existed. He had not yet begun to fight for the woman named Myra. Valdric's atonement took the shape of the seasons. 4 times a year, he would arrive in the village, not as a king with an entourage, but as a man alone on a horse. He never came to the cottage unannounced. He would send a message from the inn, a simple request to see Elara, and he would wait for Myra's permission. She always granted it. She saw the longing in her daughter's eyes, the burgeoning curiosity about this quiet, sad man who looked at her as if she were a lost treasure. He never tried to be a king with her. He never once brought her a jewel or a silken dress. He brought her books with beautiful illustrations, a well-made slingshot for chasing squirrels, and a small, sharp knife to practice her carving. He taught her how to track a deer, how to read the clouds for weather, and the names of the constellations her mother had already taught her, but he told her the old stories that went with them, tales of heroes and monsters that made her eyes shine. He was patient. He was gentle. He never pushed, never demanded the title he felt he hadn't earned. For the first year, Elara called him Valdric, mimicking her mother. He never corrected her. He simply answered to the name, his heart aching with a quiet grief each time he heard it from her lips. His time with Myra was more fraught. They spoke in quiet, stilted conversations, the air between them thick with unspoken things. He chopped wood for her, his swings growing more confident and powerful with each visit. He mended the fence around her garden. He helped the villagers with their harvests. He made himself useful, a humble penitent seeking redemption through labor. He never asked her for anything. He never spoke of her returning to the capital. He seemed to understand that his old world was a poison to her, and he did not try to mix the two. One cool autumn evening, during his second year of visits, Elara sat with him on the porch steps, drawing on a piece of slate. She was 7 now, and her questions had grown sharper, more direct. "Valdric," she said, not looking up from her drawing. Why did you make my mother sad? The question, in its devastating simplicity, landed like a stone in the quiet evening. Valdric stopped breathing for a moment. He looked at Myra, who was watching from the doorway, her expression unreadable. He knew this was the most important test he had ever faced. He could not lie to this child. She deserved the truth. He turned back to Elara, his voice low and heavy with the weight of his regret. Because I was a coward, Elara, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. I was a king, and I was so afraid of being seen as a weak king that I became a weak man. I let people say unkind things about your mother, and I did not stop them. I let her be lonely, and I did not comfort her. It was easier to fight battles with swords than to fight battles with words, and I chose the easier path. It was the greatest mistake of my life. And it hurt your mother very, very much. Elara was quiet for a long time, her chalk still on the slate. She seemed to be weighing his words, her small face serious in the fading light. Finally, she looked up at him, her blue eyes, his blue eyes, searching his face. Are you still a coward? She asked. I am trying not to be, he answered honestly. Every day, I try to be the man your mother deserved. She seemed to accept this. She went back to her drawing, and a few minutes later, she held it up for him to see. It was a wobbly, charming picture of 3 stick figures standing in front of their cottage. One was tall, one was smaller, and one was tiny. Look, she said, her voice matter-of-fact. It's our house. That's Mama, and that's me. She pointed a small, grubby finger at the tall figure. And that's you, Father. The word hung in the air, fragile and yet more powerful than any royal decree. Father. It was not a question. It was a statement. A decision she had reached in the quiet court of her own heart. Valdric felt his own heart seize in his chest. A wave of emotion so overwhelming washed over him that it stole his breath. He couldn't speak. He could only look at her, this fierce, wonderful child, and nod, his eyes flooding with tears he didn't try to hide. From the doorway, Myra watched, and the last of the ice around her own heart began to crack. He had not won their daughter with gifts or promises. He had won her with the truth. He had given her the one thing a child needs most from a parent, an honest accounting of his own failures. And in doing so, he had finally begun to earn the right to be called father. The 3rd year of Valdric's visits marked a quiet, unspoken shift. The tension that had once hummed between him and Myra had softened into a kind of gentle, melancholic peace. Elara now ran to greet him as father whenever he arrived, throwing her arms around his legs in an embrace that Valdric received like a holy sacrament. He was part of the fabric of their lives, a predictable and steady presence. The man who arrived on his horse each season was no longer the king who had failed her, but the father who showed up for their daughter. The question of what he was to her, however, remained unanswered. He was not her husband. They did not touch. They slept in separate rooms when he stayed at the cottage, which was happening more often now, at Elara's insistence. He was a guest, a friend, a co-parent. But the ghost of the husband he had been, and the husband he might be, was always in the room with them. One night, after Elara was asleep, they sat by the fire, the crackle of the logs the only sound in the small, warm room. The silence was no longer a weapon or a shield, it was just a space between them, filled with the weight of their shared history. Valdric stared into the flames, his face illuminated by the flickering light. The lines of grief that had been so stark 3 years ago had softened, replaced by a quiet strength, a settled sense of self. The court is different now, he said, his voice low. Your name is spoken only with respect. The story of what happened, it has become a lesson. A legend of sorts. The tale of the king who had to lose his queen to learn how to rule. Myra said nothing, continuing to mend one of Elara's tunics, her needle moving in a steady, rhythmic motion. They want you to come back, he continued, still not looking at her. They ask for their queen. Myra's hands stilled. She set the tunic aside. I am not their queen, Valdric. I stopped being that a long time ago. I can't live in that cage again. I can't breathe that air. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were filled with a complete and profound understanding. There was no argument, no persuasion. Only acceptance. I know, he said softly. I would never ask you to. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. Myra, I did not spend 3 years trying to earn my way back to the throne room. I spent them trying to earn my way back to this room. To you, his voice was raw with an earnestness that stripped away the last vestiges of the king. What do you want? Tell me what life you want, and I will build it for you. With you. If you will have me. My life is here, she said, her voice barely a whisper. With my daughter. My garden. The woods. Then our life will be here, he said without hesitation. I don't need the citadel. A kingdom can be run from a desk in a forest as easily as from a throne, if the king is wise enough to know what truly matters. We can build a new house. Not a palace. A home. Here, at the edge of the woods. Big enough for Elara to have rooms to grow in, with a library for you and a workshop for me. We would go to the capital only when necessary. The power is not in the stone walls, Myra. I see that now. The power is in. This he gestured around the small, simple room, at the warmth of the fire, at the quiet peace. This was the moment. This was the final test, the one she hadn't even known she was waiting for. He was not asking her to return to his world. He was offering to join hers. He was willing to abdicate not his throne, but the trappings of it, the very things that had blinded him and poisoned their life together. He was choosing her, and the life she had built, over the life he had inherited. Slowly, she unfolded her hands from her lap. The years of anger, of bitterness, of guarded loneliness, seemed to fall away, leaving behind the deep, aching love she had tried so hard to bury. It was not the same love she'd had for the young prince. It was something deeper, quieter, more resilient. It was a love that had been tested by fire and ice, a love that had seen the worst of him and had watched, with grudging admiration, as he painstakingly built himself into a better man. She reached across the small space between them and laid her hand on his. His skin was warm, his palm calloused from the work he had done for her, for them. It was the first time she had willingly touched him in 8 years. He flinched at the contact, a sharp intake of breath, as if her touch were both a balm and a brand. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, his grip gentle but firm, a silent promise. A library, she said, a small smile finally touching her lips. It would have to have a very large window, facing the sunrise. Tears welled in his eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. We will build you a window so large it will feel as if you are sitting in the sky, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He squeezed her hand, a silent, desperate prayer of thanks. Myra, her name was all he could manage, but it was enough. It was everything. They did not leave the village. Not right away. True to his word, Valdric began the process of ruling from a distance. Couriers became a common sight on the road to the small hamlet, carrying dispatch boxes and scrolls of state. He bought a large plot of land on the hill overlooking Myra's cottage, and architects arrived not with plans for a fortress, but for a sprawling, comfortable manor house made of local stone and timber, with wide windows and rambling gardens. Myra and Elara watched it take shape, stone by stone. It was not a palace, but a home, designed for living, not for display. The villagers, who had long ago accepted their sad man as a permanent fixture, now understood. They watched the king of the realm working alongside the masons, his sleeves rolled up, a smudge of mortar on his cheek, and they nodded with quiet approval. This was a man who understood the value of building something with his own hands. When the house was finished, they moved in. Elara was delighted, running through the echoing halls, choosing the room with the best view of the woods for her own. Myra walked into the library and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The entire eastern wall was a single, seamless pane of glass, a marvel of engineering Valdric had commissioned from the finest artisans in the kingdom. It looked out over the rolling hills, and as the morning sun streamed in, it felt as though the room was floating in the light. Bookshelves, already filled with volumes Valdric had painstakingly curated for her, lined the other walls. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. It was a promise, made of glass and wood and paper, and it was fulfilled. Their life found a new rhythm. They spent most of the year at the manor, which the locals came to call the King's Retreat. Valdric was a devoted father, a present and attentive husband. He and Myra would spend hours in the library, reading in companionable silence, or walking the forest paths, their hands intertwined. The love between them was not a fiery, youthful passion, but a deep, quiet current of mutual respect and hard-won understanding. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer open wounds. They were part of the tapestry of their story, a reminder of the cost of their happiness and the strength it had taken to achieve it. Twice a year, they would travel to the capital. Myra's return to the citadel was not the triumphant entrance of a long-lost queen, but a quiet arrival. She was no longer the frightened, isolated girl. She was a woman of immense and quiet power, her confidence rooted not in her title but in her own self-worth. The court that greeted her was a new one, reshaped by Valdric's decree. They saw not a base-born commoner, but the woman who had humbled a king and taught him the true meaning of strength. They saw the mother of their future queen, Elara, who moved through the castle with the wild grace of the forest and the innate dignity of her father. They revered Myra, not for her blood, but for her story. One evening, they stood on a balcony of the citadel, looking out over the glittering city lights, the same view Myra had seen the night she decided to leave. Elara, now 10 years old, was asleep inside, tired from a day of lessons. "Do you ever regret it?" Valdric asked softly, his arm around her shoulders. "Leaving, I mean." Myra was quiet for a moment, breathing in the cool night air. "I regret the pain," she said. "I regret the years our daughter didn't have a father. But I don't regret leaving. It was the only way for us to find our way here." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You had to lose a queen, Valdric, to learn how to love a woman." He tightened his embrace, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I was a fool who was given a treasure and did not know its worth until the chest was empty." She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cup his face. She looked into his winter sky eyes, no longer clouded with storms, but clear and deep. "But you came back for it," she whispered. "You fought for it." He smiled then, a real smile, one that reached his soul and lit his face from within. It was the smile she had fallen in love with all those years ago in a dusty library. He had finally found his way back to her, not as a king claiming his possession, but as a man returning home. The silence had been broken, the name defended, the family made whole not by birthright or decree, but by the slow, difficult, and beautiful work of earning love.